Part 34. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 331. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. He turned around and glanced coldly at Xiao William. A bit of contempt flashed in his eyes, and the corners of his mouth curled up. A hint of a sneer. "Do you think I would be scared if I dared to come?" The two people looked at each other, and Lin Yu's eyes flashed a bit of coldness. After hearing what Lin Yu said, little William couldn't help but burst out laughing. At this time, little William seemed to be a complete madman. All the people at the banquet looked towards little William, but these guys at the banquet seemed to have long been accustomed to all this. After taking one look, they continued dancing and drinking. "Very good. Then today I would like to congratulate the two of us on officially becoming enemies." Little William picked up the wine glass, took a sip, and then turned around and left. At this time, Lin Yu was too lazy to stay here anymore. At this time, Lin Yu turned around like this leave. But just when he left here and walked into the garden, he saw a beautiful figure slowly walking towards him. After Lin Yu saw that person, he couldn't help but frown slightly, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes also flashed a bit of confusion. His eyes were staring straight at the woman walking towards him, and then his brows seemed to be knitted together. Lin Yu glanced at the woman, with a teasing smile at the corner of his mouth. "Excuse me, what's the matter?" After the woman heard what Lin Yu said, her face twisted slightly, her upper lip biting her lower lip, as if she was struggling with something. At this time, Lin Yu also smiled like this after seeing the woman like this. "If there's nothing else, I'll leave." Lin Yu said this and wanted to turn around and leave, but at this moment, the woman suddenly spoke. "Help." After Lin Yu heard what the woman said, there was a strange light in her eyes, and then she raised her brows slightly. "What do you mean by this? Why can't I understand it?" At this time, the woman ran directly in front of Lin Yu. Her eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the corners of her eyes and brows were filled with a look of pleading. "Help." After hearing what the woman said, Lin Yu's face was slightly moved. Susan, this woman, was really good at pretending. That pitiful look was probably even the most beautiful thing in the world. Even hard rocks can melt. Lin Yu frowned slightly, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he sighed leisurely. "Oh, there's really nothing I can do, it's such a headache. Tell me, how do you want me to help you?" At this time, Susan's eyes clearly flashed with excitement, but she just smiled after a moment. "Follow me." As Susan said, she directly pulled Lin Yu away. After Lin Yu saw this scene, a bit of confusion flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly. At this moment, he was like a 2-foot-tall monk who was confused and had no idea what kind of medicine was being sold in Susan's gourd. Susan pulled Lin Yu directly to the parking lot, and then he found his car, and then waved to Lin Yu. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but frown slightly. He turned his head and glanced at Susan, with a bit of confusion flashing in his eyes. "What on earth do you mean? Why don't I quite understand?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Susan. At this time, Susan playfully stuck out her tongue towards Lin Yu, and a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "It contains countless things. You'll find out soon." After Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he also frowned slightly. At this moment, he always felt that the woman in front of him was a little unpredictable. But at this moment, Lin Yu still sat in Susan's passenger seat, and then Susan started the car directly. The driving on this road was quite smooth. "Now that I'm in the car, you should tell me where our destination is." At this time, Susan turned her head and glanced in Lin Yu's direction. A charming smile suddenly appeared on the corner of her mouth. "As for this, you will know after a while." At this time, Lin Yu frowned slightly, with a bit of confusion in his eyes. Susan directly dragged Lin Yu to a very remote place. The street lights here were all broken, so it looked particularly gloomy. Lin Yu never expected that Susan, the daughter of a dignified William family, would come to a place like this. He turned his head and glanced at Susan. In the corners of his eyes and brows, there was a complete expression of excitement. It was an expression of disbelief. "I really never thought that you would come to such a place." After Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she was also so naughty towards Lin Yu, sticking out her tongue, and a bit of playfulness flashed in her eyes. "There are many things you didn't expect, but these don't seem to be important." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead. At this time, he was not happy and rolled his eyes at Susan. "But what are you doing here? This is my secret base, my secret. Even my 2 brothers don't know it exists." After Lin Yu heard Susan say this, a playful smile suddenly appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of playfulness flashed in his eyes. "So, it's really my honor." After Susan heard Lin Yu say this, she nodded slightly, and then a very special light flashed in her eyes. A smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and the meaning contained 1,000 things. "If you think so, it's actually true. You are indeed the first boy I brought to this place. You are very special." After Susan finished speaking, she smiled charmingly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 332. At this time, after Lin Yu saw Susan like this, he couldn't help but shake his head and smile. He turned his head and glanced at Susan, and then frowned slightly. "Tell me what you want to do, get straight to the point, I don't like nonsense, you know." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Susan shook her head and smiled. "I'm in a good mood today and want to come and have a drink with you. Is there any problem? If you don't want to, forget it." At this time, Susan's eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, and Lin Yu's eyes were also staring directly at Susan. At this moment, Lin Yu really couldn't figure out what a little girl Susan was. What kind of medicine is being sold in the gourd? At this time, Lin Yu knitted his brows together and said, "I don't want to know what exactly you want to do with me here, but I still say that, if you have nothing to do, then I will leave." As Lin Yu said that, he wanted to turn around and leave, but at this time, Susan just lightly stamped her feet. "If you leave today, I guarantee you will regret it." At this time, after Lin Yu heard Susan say this, he actually stopped. Then he turned his head and glanced at Susan, with a few meaningful words raised at the corners of his mouth. "Smile. Really? I often do things I regret, but I have never regretted it. Since you don't want to say it, I won't force you. Goodbye." After Lin Yu finished speaking, he walked straight forward, and at this time, Susan stamped her feet like this, and then chased after Lin Yu. "There is a very important person here. This person may be the key to the assassination of my brother. I know that you are investigating the person who assassinated my brother, but the person who assassinated my brother is probably not sent by my little brother." At this time, after Lin Yu heard Susan say this, he stopped walking. At this time, he turned his head and glanced at Susan, with a flash in his eyes. "Strange colors. Are you telling the truth?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan. At this time, Sushan suddenly smiled. "That's natural, otherwise why do you think I lied to you?" At this time, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly after hearing what Susan said. "It's interesting. It's really interesting. If that's the case, it's really worth checking out." At this time, Sushan stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face. "How is it? I didn't lie to you." Lin Yu nodded lightly and smiled. "Maybe." The 2 people just walked in. There was no light at the end of the alley. At this time, Susan's little hand subconsciously grabbed Lin Yu's clothes, which seemed to be very nervous. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled, with a hint of joking flashing in his eyes. Don't you come here often? Logically speaking, you should walk the road here often. Why are you scared now? Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly like this. After Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she also stamped her feet like this. Asshole, who said I'm afraid? I'm not afraid. As Susan spoke at this time, she let go of Lin Yu's clothes and deliberately kept a distance from Lin Yu. But at this time, a wildcat passed through him like this. Susan quickly ran to Lin Yu's side and hugged Lin Yu. 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Susan. In this dark environment, Susan could even see Lin Yu's eyes clearly. Susan's pretty face turned red. What are you looking at? What's there to see? Just now, it was just that wildcat. It was so abominable. Hurry up and leave. As Susan spoke, she walked forward. Lin Yu stared straight at Susan's back, and then shook his head. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly noticed something strange. At this moment, his face suddenly darkened, and a hint of solemnity flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. He just shook his head, and then he frowned slightly. No, no. At this time, Susan was walking alone in front of her. As she walked, Susan was cursing, asshole, bastard, there is no such thing as a good man in the world. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly rushed to Susan's side, and then hugged her in his arms. At this time, after Susan felt Lin Yu's embrace, she struggled desperately, and then she slapped Lin Yu randomly. Asshole, let me go quickly, you bastard. After hearing what Susan said, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a bit of solemnity. At this time, he said to Susan in a deep voice, don't move, if you don't want to die, just stay still. Susan had never seen Lin Yu look so serious, so for a moment, she really stopped what she was doing. At this moment, Susan stared at Lin Yu, with a hint of confusion in her eyes and eyebrows, and then she said in a deep voice, what's going on? What happened? At this time, Lin Yu had no time to care about Susan. He just looked around and finally sneered. What's the point of hiding? If you have the ability, show up. At this time, Lin Yu's voice just fell, and then a figure suddenly appeared at the end of the street. The figure's eyes stared at Lin Yu, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Oh, I didn't expect it, I didn't expect that you, a little kid, could actually find me, but even so, what can you do? Even if you find me, you are not my opponent. If you know what's good for you, don't make those meaningless struggles. After Lin Yu heard the man say this, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 333. It has never been my style to be captured without restraint, so I will never be captured without restraint. It's a mule or a horse out for a walk. I want to see how powerful you are. Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at that person, with a bit of gloom flashing in his eyes. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the corners of the person's mouth also curled up a little. He sneered quite a bit, and there was a bit of mockery in his eyes. Ha ha ha, after so many years, this is the first time I have seen such a ignorant guy. Since you are determined to die, I will help you today. Of course, there is also Miss Susan. At this time, after Susan heard the old man calling out her name, his face suddenly became pale and ugly. Susan's eyes were fixed on the old man, and then the brows seemed to be knitted together. Who are you? You are here for me, right? Who sent you here? If you are here for me, don't hurt those innocent people. Susan's eyes were staring straight at the old man. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, the old man also sneered a little at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of ridicule. Miss Susan, you really have too many words. If I don't want to answer, then I won't answer. The old man just said it in a cold voice in a leisurely manner, with a complete sense of ridicule in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after Susan heard what the old man said, her face began to change, and she looked a little ugly. At this time, she also took a deep breath. Okay, but since someone wants me to die, then telling me who wants me to die seems not too much to ask. After the old man heard what Susan said, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly, and then frowned. There are some things I can't say, please forgive me, Miss Susan. At this moment, the old man nailed Susan with a smile on his face. At this moment, when Susan heard what the old man said, a sense of powerlessness came from her heart. She just like that, he lowered his voice and spoke to Lin Yu. This old guy is here for me. We will run separately in a while. He won't chase you. You may have a chance to escape by then. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he felt a little moved in his heart. At this time, a few meaningful smiles appeared on the corners of his mouth, and then he rubbed Susan's little head like this. Don't be so pessimistic. We may not die this time. You're right. At this time, Susan heard Lin Yu. After saying this, there was a bit of a bitter smile on the corner of her mouth, and a bit of helplessness on the corners of her eyes and brows, and then she sighed heavily. He sighed and shook his head helplessly. Oh, you don't even know. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. What don't I know? The strange beast in this old man's body is a 10,000-year-old black bat, so if the two of us want to escape in front of him, there is no way. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, the old man also laughed like this, and then nodded slightly. Yes, what Miss Susan said is indeed true. Of course, if you want to escape, you can also give it a try. My 10,000-year-old Black Bolt King has not drank blood for many days, so I just happened to get it today. Have an appetizer, you too. After the old man finished speaking, he recited a very strange spell. At this time, after Lin Yu heard the spell, a mocking smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Between the brows, there was also a look of ridicule. Interesting, it's really interesting. I didn't expect it, I didn't expect it. At this time, after the old man heard what Lin Yu said, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Boy, what didn't you expect? If you have the guts, tell me. A mocking smile appeared at the corners of Lin Yu's lips, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a look of ridicule. What do you think? At this time, the old man half squinted his eyes, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. What did I say? I said you were going to die. After the old man finished speaking, he thought like this, and then a black bat appeared directly in front of Lin Yu. Black Bolt, kill him. At this time, Lin Yu saw a red-black bat floating in the air in front of him. Lin Yu's face sank slightly, and a special look flashed in his eyes. Color. It's interesting. It's really interesting. There are barbs on the wings of this bat. Those barbs seem to be able to cut through the sky. Even in this dark night, they are shining with a cold light. Alien Beast, Black Bolt Lord Level 6, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Intermediate. Life, 9999999. Speed, 9999999. Defense, 9999999. Attack, 9999999. Skills, Black Belly splits the sky, tearing the sky and splitting the earth, Absolute Shadow Cold Blade Slash. Black Belly splits the sky. Black Bat activates a skill, using the double cold stabs on his wings to repeatedly tear the space, completely tearing the surrounding space apart, killing people invisibly. Tearing the sky and splitting the earth, Black Bat activates a skill, repeatedly splitting the space, and shuttles freely in the space, which can cause disorder in one side of the space, causing space turbulence, and using space turbulence to devour the enemy. Absolute Shadow Cold Blade Slash, Black Bat activates a skill, using his backstab to completely strangle the enemy. The skill is indestructible, and this stab contains neurotoxins. If an ordinary person is contaminated by half a point, he will die. When Lin Yu saw the Black Bat King, his lips curled up with a hint of amusement and his eyes flashed with a hint of mockery. At this time, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly, and his eyebrows were full of contempt and disdain. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 334. When Lin Yu saw the old man, he couldn't help but shake his head and smile. The corners of his eyes and brows were full of disdain, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a bit of a sneer. I originally thought that it was so powerful and capable, but now it seems that it is nothing more than that, not worth mentioning at all. At this time, Lin Yu said in a cold voice. After the old man heard what Lin Yu said, a slight sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and there was a look of ridicule in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Little guy, I know you are about to face the fear of death. It doesn't matter, old Black Bold King. These swords are very fast. You won't feel pain and can send you to hell. Isn't this enough? Okay. Lin Yu heard this. After the old man said this, he just shook his head. Oh, the ignorant are fearless. Today I finally understand. At this moment, Susan, who was standing by her, had a look of helplessness in her eyes and brows. After seeing the Black Bat King, Susan's face flashed with deep worry. There was a bit of a wry smile at the corner of his mouth. It seems like this is my fate. I'm afraid I'm going to be doomed today. A bitter smile appeared on the corner of Susan's mouth, and a hint of helplessness flashed in her eyes. Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at Susan, and then gently patted Susan on the shoulder. The two of us may not die. After Susan heard what Lin Yu said, she rolled her eyes at him angrily. There is no need to comfort me like this now. This is a Lord-level alien beast. How can we possibly defeat it? At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. What if we can beat him? Susan only thought that Lin Yu was joking with her, so she said softly, if you can really beat me, I can grant you a request. Lin Yu stared straight at Susan, and then he stretched out two fingers and gently lifted Susan's chin. Are you telling the truth? At this time, Susan also nodded so heavily. I never lie to people. Lin Yu also laughed like this at that time. Ha ha ha, remember what you said. At this moment, the old man was obviously a little angry. After all, Lin Yu did not take him seriously. At this time, the old man's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness. Boy, since you want to seek death, you really can't explain it if I don't succeed. After the old man finished speaking, he just waved his hand gently, and then Black Bat King suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu. The Black Bat King was extremely fast at this moment. In just one breath, he had already arrived in front of Lin Yu. There was also a sneer on the corner of the old man's mouth, and in the corners of his eyes and brows, there was a complete smile. It's all a gloomy meaning. Boy, be good and accept death. But at this moment, Lin Yu didn't care at all. There was a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and brows. How ridiculous. Lin Yu had just finished speaking, and then the space-time beast appeared in front of Lin Yu like this. At this time, the Black Bat King directly hit the first layer of space barrier. At this time, the Black Bat King saw after the space-time beast. He immediately turned around and wanted to escape. But at this time, neither Lin Yu nor the space-time beast could let the Black Bat King leave so easily. Lin Yu also had a slight sneer on his lips, and a hint of mockery flashed in his eyes. Meaning, since you want to seek death, I will help you today. At this time, after seeing this scene, the old man's legs were almost weak from fear. At this time, he was trembling, and in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, there was a complete sense of helplessness. At this moment, he just swallowed a mouthful of saliva. How is it possible? How can your boy be so powerful? This thing is absolutely impossible, this thing is absolutely impossible. This time and space beast is an epic beast. How could it be in your boys? At this time, the old man hadn't finished speaking, and then he felt a strong sense of oppression, and then he let out a painful scream, and the blood on his body was also sprayed bit by bit like this. Squeezed out. At this time, the old man's face gradually became ferocious, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but at this time he felt a powerful force around him, leaving him speechless at all. Nothing is impossible. You think it's impossible just because you look down on others. Lin Yu said in a cold voice, with a slight sneer on the corner of his mouth. At this time, the Black Bat King was directly hit by the space-time beast to tear apart time and space, and then exploded into a ball of blood mist. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu's eyes also flashed with a bit of complexity, and the corner of his mouth also evoked a bit of a sneer. How is it? How do you feel now? If it feels good, then can the two of us discuss the next question? At this time, the old man's face suddenly became ugly after hearing what Lin Yu said. His eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, and his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together. What do you want to say? At this time, after hearing what the old man said, Lin Yu also raised a few sneers at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of gloom. Tell me who sent you. At this time, the old man felt that the pressure around him was much less. At this time, his face began to become slightly ruddy, and then the old man gasped heavily, as if he had never breathed before. He looked quite embarrassed and ridiculous, and no longer as arrogant as before. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu also raised a few sneers at the corners of his mouth, and a few cold colors flashed in his eyes and eyebrows. After waiting for a while, the old man raised his head and looked towards Lin Yu, then frowned. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 335. At this time, the old man's eyes and eyebrows were full of struggle. He opened his mouth and seemed to want to say something, but the words seemed to be swallowed back. After waiting for a while, the old man just shook his head. He raised his head and looked at Lin Yu, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Today's incident is indeed my fault. I have nothing to say, and there is nothing to say. But as for the person behind the scenes you mentioned, I can't tell you today. If I don't tell you, I will die at most. If I really tell you, I am afraid that the lives of my whole family will be in danger. Lin Yu heard the old man say this, and saw the death in his eyes. He could conclude that what the old man said to him was not false. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the old man, and a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Then he raised his eyebrows slightly, and a sneer appeared at the corners of his mouth. So? You don't want to tell me, right? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the old man, and the old man closed his eyes at this time, and then a meaningful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. That's right, you can kill me or cut me up, but I really can't tell you about that person. At this time, Susan took a step forward, and a sneer appeared at the corners of her mouth, and a gloomy look flashed in her eyes. Are you sure about this matter? Are you really determined not to tell us? Susan said in a cold voice, and there was a gloomy look in her eyes and eyebrows. At this time, the old man swallowed his saliva after seeing Susan like this, and his eyes were fixed on Susan. At this moment, he suddenly had a trace of cold sweat in his heart. "That's right, Miss Susan, I really can't tell you who that person is, so please kill me directly." At this time, the old man closed his eyes directly after he finished speaking, and Susan's mouth corners also curled up a sneer, and then he took a step forward directly. "Okay, since you want to die, then if I don't fulfill your wish, it's really a bit unreasonable. Today I will fulfill your wish. But that person knows your background, do you think I don't know your background?" After Susan finished speaking, she wanted to take action. He directly pulled out a pocket pistol inlaid with diamonds from his waist. After Lin Yu saw the scene at this time, 3-point lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. The old man seemed to know Susan's methods, so he turned his head and looked at Susan at this time, with a little pleading in his eyes. Can you not hurt my wife and children, and those people in my family?" Susan's mouth curled up a sneer. "Don't you know the methods of this young lady? Do you think your requests will work for this young lady?" At this time, Susan's eyes were burning, and at this time, after seeing this scene, the old man's mouth curled up a little bitter smile, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of helplessness. "But there is nothing to but, dear, die. I will greet your abandoned children one by one. Anyway, that person doesn't want me to live, why should I let your wife and children live?" At this time, Susan said in a cold voice, and his eyes were quite gloomy. The old man's mouth corners also raised a few bitter smiles, and the whole person's eyes began to dim. After a moment, he seemed to have made a major decision, and then he gritted his teeth. "I agree, I promise to tell you who it is." After hearing what the old man said, Susan's mouth corners also raised a few sneers, and a few complacent colors flashed between the corners of her eyes and eyebrows, and then she looked at Lin Yu as if asking for credit. Then Susan mischievously stuck out her tongue at Lin Yu, and this cute look was completely different from the previous devilish look. At this time, Lin Yu couldn't figure out the details of this little girl for a while. His eyes just stared straight at Susan, his brows just frowned slightly, and he didn't know what he was thinking in his heart. After waiting for this moment, the old man sighed heavily. "In fact, I don't know who that person is, but I know his purpose." After Susan heard what the old man said, a special color flashed in her eyes. "What is that person's purpose? Tell me quickly. Your William family has a secret in the bloodline. Of course, this secret may not even be known to you, but that person knows it from somewhere. In fact, your William family's bloodline is the key to open the ruins of our Western Gods battlefield, so that person deliberately wants to kill you." After Susan heard what the old man said, her face became a little abnormal. At this time, she stared at the old man with her eyes. "Our family's blood can open the ruins of the gods in the ancient battlefield. In this case, I should not be alive. Why does he want to kill me? You are probably contradictory in saying this. It's very simple, because only if you take out your heart blood, and it is full of resentment, can you cause the resonance of the ancient battlefield of the gods and open the ruins of the ancient battlefield of the gods." After Lin Yu and Susan heard what the old man said, there was a flash of confusion in their eyes. At this time, the two of them looked at each other, just like this monk, confused. And at this time, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. "Who contacted you? Don't tell me that it was that guy who contacted you directly, and I don't believe that you don't have a middleman." After the old man heard Lin Yu, he also raised a bitter smile at the corner of his mouth. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 336. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, and a helpless smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. There was a complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. Well, can I not talk about this? At this time, the old man's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, his eyes full of begging, as if he was begging Lin Yu for a high platform and a hand to let him go. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the old man said, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and a murderous intention came from him. At this point, a hint of contempt flashed in his eyes. What do you think? After the old man heard what Lin Yu said, his expression froze slightly, and then a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Susan beggingly. Please, don't let me say that person's name, otherwise, I will definitely die this time. That person is too scary, that person is too scary. At this time, a hint of begging flashed across his eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu turned around after hearing what the man said, staring straight at the guy. A complicated light flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Raise an eyebrow. But although I can promise you, I'm afraid she won't agree. At this time, Lin Yu pointed at Susan. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Susan's eyes and brows raised a bit of special color, and then there was a hint of amusement at the corner of her mouth. Smile. She turned her head towards the old man and just glanced coldly. I don't want to talk nonsense to you, but this time, if you don't give me an explanation, it won't be so easy to get over it. Susan's eyes were staring straight at the old man, and at this time the old man gritted his teeth. It's a guy named Wan Hao, the one he introduced me to, but I have never seen that guy before. Man, even the news I just told you was something I heard from him and Marriott occasionally. There was a bit of a wry smile on the corner of the old man's mouth, and there was a complete sense of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after Susan heard what the old man said, her eyes narrowed to a slit. Her eyes were fixed directly on the old man, and then she raised her eyebrow slightly. Eyebrow. Are you telling the truth? Are you sure you didn't lie to me? At this time, Susan's face obviously became a little ugly. At this time, her pretty face was filled with a kind of pale color, and a bit of panic flashed in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu frowned slightly, turned his head and glanced at Susan. A hint of concern flashed across his brows. You look a little ugly, are you okay? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan, and the concern in the corners of his eyes and brows was very obvious. At this time, Sushan waved her hands like this, with a wry smile on her lips. No, it doesn't matter. But it was obvious that Lin Yu didn't believe this. He frowned slightly and said, is it possible that the guy he mentioned is scary? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan, and there was a hint of concern in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, Susan also had a wry smile on her lips. Yes, it's terrible, and it can't be described as simply terrible. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he couldn't help but frown slightly, turned his head, and glanced towards the mountain, with a bit of solemnity flashing in his eyes. Are you telling the truth? At this time, Susan rolled her eyes at Lin Yu angrily. Then do you think I need to lie to you? Susan's eyes were burning, and her eyes were like torches. Then what is this person's identity? Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Susan. At this time, he was still quite unbelievable. At this moment, Susan also took a deep breath and calmed down her mood slightly. We don't know how powerful this strange beast in Wan Hao is, but we only know that anyone who has fought with him, everyone dies without exception, and he has an underground boxing ring. Susan paused immediately after saying this. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, and there seemed to be a hint of something very connotative flashing through his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu nodded so gently, and then raised his eyebrows slightly. Okay, I probably understand what you said. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes and brows were full of teasing, but he didn't take Songshan's words too seriously. At this time, When Susan saw Lin Yu like this, a hint of connotation flashed through her eyes, and then she raised her eyebrows slightly. I know you may not agree with it now, but you have to believe me, I am not lying to you, this man is really terrible. My father once said that a man can match half of the army of country Y. At this moment, after hearing what Susan said, Lin Yu just spread his hands and smiled, and then nodded slightly. The more you talk now, the more interested I am in this guy. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, 3 black lines appeared on Susan's forehead, and she was speechless in her heart. She rolled her eyes at Lin Yu in annoyance. Believe it or not, if you don't believe this, forget it. After Susan finished speaking, she turned around and left, and Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan's back. At this time, he couldn't help but shook his head and smiled helplessly. Hey, why are you so angry? Did I say something wrong? At this moment, Lin Yu was like a confused monk, totally confused and couldn't understand why Susan was like this. And just after this moment, the old man glanced at the two of them, with a look of death in his eyes. Go. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 337. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly took a step forward. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. This is what you said, don't regret it? Lin Yu said in a cold voice, with a gloomy meaning in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, when the old man saw Lin Yu like this, he couldn't help but feel a little thump in his heart, and then he closed his eyes in pain, as if he had resigned himself to his fate, hearing such a cold voice from his mouth. Said. Do it. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the old man said, he couldn't help laughing, and then he waved casually. Forget it. Since you honestly confessed who was behind this, I'll let you go for the time being. But it's just this once. If there is a next time, don't blame me for being rude. Lin Yu's eyes stared straight at the old man, and then he turned away from the old man with Susan. At this time, the old man's eyes were staring directly at the backs of the two of them, with a look of complete disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. What? They actually let me go like that? Why on earth did they do that? After the old man thought of this, he couldn't help but frown slightly, but after a moment he shook his head. I'm really a bitch. It's a good thing that they let me go. What am I still thinking about here? After the old man finished speaking, he turned around and left. After waiting for this moment, the old man seemed to suddenly remember something. His expression suddenly froze, and then he shook his head. No, there seems to be something wrong with this matter. And at this moment, a person slowly walked out of the street. That person walked straight towards the old man, with a bit of teasing in his eyes. Oh, you are actually able to sense that something is wrong. You are really quite capable. Doesn't it feel good to betray me? The man just said it in a cold and unhurried voice, with a few meaningful smiles on the corners of his mouth. But when the old man saw this man, he felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, and his eyes were straight. He stared at this person with a look of disbelief in his eyes. How is that possible? Why is it you? At this time, after the man heard what the old man said, the sneer at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. He slowly walked towards Lao Lao, with a sharp feeling on his body. The killing intent was quietly released. Yeah, how could it be me? How could I appear here? Did I scare you? If so, then I want to say sorry to you. The man stared at the old man with a smile on his face, and the murderous intention in his body began to become more and more obvious. At this time, the old man subconsciously retreated towards the back. After a few steps, he managed to regain his balance. You, I'm warning you not to come over. If you dare to come over. After the man heard what the old man said, he couldn't help laughing. There was a bit of madness in his eyes, and the murderous intention on his body became more and more obvious. What am I? If I dare to come here, what can you do to me? Do you want to kill me? Really? The man said in a cold and unhurried voice, but the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a gloomy look, and the murderous intention became more and more fierce, making people unable to help it. There is a sense of fear. The old man couldn't help but shake his head at that time. No, no. At this time, a sneer appeared on the corner of the man's mouth, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. No? What is that? You're telling me? The man just said this, almost gritting his teeth, and the old man just slumped down on the ground. In the end, his eyes were lifeless, and he seemed to have lost his soul. I have only one request, and I hope you can grant it to me. The man's face was as gloomy as water, and then he said in a cold voice, you can tell me what you want to beg for, but whether I agree to it or not depends entirely on my mood. Let my family go. This matter has nothing to do with them. I know it was me who betrayed you this time. You must be very unhappy, but don't worry. I just told them about Marriott, and you and Marriott doesn't matter. The man just smiled like this, you are smart enough not to betray me completely this time. Otherwise, your whole family would really have to accompany you. But nowadays, death penalty can be avoided, but living crime cannot be escaped. You will still die, but I can promise you to let your wife, children go. After the old man heard what the man said, his face was also happy, and then he nodded like a chicken pecking at rice. Thank you, sir, thank you, sir. The corner of the man's mouth just evoked a sneer. No need to thank me, just accept your death. After the man finished speaking, he suddenly turned around, jumped up, and then jumped to the side of the old man. At this time, he saw a cold light flashing as he raised his knife, and then the old man's throat was cut by him, and then he fell straight to the ground, and blood flowed all over the ground. The man clapped his hands lightly, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Some people can't make wrong choices. One wrong step will lead to all wrong steps, so you can only die, don't blame me. After the man finished speaking, he stepped over the old man, and then disappeared in the dark alley, leaving only the old man's body, with his eyes wide open and full of unwillingness. In the night, several wild dogs came to the old man and slowly began to eat the old man's body. It must be said that the old man's life was indeed full of ups and downs, and he ended up like this in the end. It is really lamentable that he doesn't know where the sorrow comes from, and where the joy goes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 338. And at this moment, a person walked over quietly from a distance. The person walked to the side of the previous guy, turned his head and glanced towards him, and there was something in his eyes. The 3 points were very connotative, and then he glanced at the old man who fell on the ground and shook his head. This guy is really good at killing people, but he always leaves me a mess. It's really a headache to talk about. At this time, after the man finished speaking, he took out a small bottle from his pocket, and then sprinkled the small bottle of bone powder on the old man's body. Today, for a moment, the old man the corpse instantly turned into a puddle of thick water. After the man finished all this, he turned around and left. At this time, Lin Yu and Susan were walking towards the bar. At this time, Susan looked gloomy as if it's like water dripping out. At this time, Lin Yu also suddenly spoke. You shouldn't be here this time to investigate the murderer of your brother's murder, right? I'm right. Lin Yu just spoke in a cold and unhurried voice. At this time, after Susan heard Lin Yu say this, she was slightly happy at first, and finally raised her head, turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu. At this time, the corner of her mouth he evoked a few meaningful smiles, and then frowned slightly. What do you mean? Why can't I understand you? At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he just snorted, but there is no need for me to pretend like this anymore. You still don't know what is going on. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Susan. After a moment, Susan also smiled like this, and then she naughtily vomited in Lin Yu's direction. Tongue, a bit of charm flashed in his eyes. You are really a smart man. A woman will definitely not be able to marry you because you are too smart. If a woman marries you, then he will definitely be very unhappy. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a trace of amusement flashed in his eyes. How do you say this? Why? Because that woman will definitely have no secrets at all. Before she even has any secrets, I'm afraid she will be completely exposed by you. Isn't this the greatest misfortune in the world? Susan's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and at this moment, the corner of Lin Yu's mouth was just a bit of a sneer. Forget it, I don't want to talk so much nonsense to you. Let's talk about it. Look, why did you bring me here this time? Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as a torch, and at this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Susan hesitated for a moment and then smiled like this. Actually, it's very simple. This time, I'm here to get the map of the ruins of the battlefield of the ancient gods. The map is in the hands of the bar owner. I hope you can help me. You need to know what is in the ruins of the ancient gods. As long as we get the contents, it will be distributed. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, there was a bit of sneer on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of ridicule flashed in his eyes. Then do you think this is possible? Susan's brows furrowed slightly. At this time, her face condensed. Why is it impossible? What do you mean? Lin Yu just smiled and said, it's not interesting, I just think you are a bit innocent and cute. I'm afraid the map is no longer in his hands. Susan's face suddenly turned ugly. At this moment, she seemed to have remembered something and ran towards the bar. Lin Yu looked at Susan's back. Just shook his head and smiled, it's exactly what I said, innocence is kind of cute. At this time, Susan was stunned the moment she opened the door. Her eyes were full of disbelief, and then she turned her head, her eyes fixed. He stared at Lin Yu, with a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. How is it possible? Here, here. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he walked over slowly, and then he saw corpses scattered in the bar under the dim light. At this moment, Susan's eyes and eyebrows were filled with a look of complete disbelief. At this time, he hurriedly ran to the bar owner's bar, but he did not find the bar owner. This was her. A ray of comfort in despair. But at this moment, Susan still found it hard to believe that such a thing had happened. At this time, Susan seemed to suddenly remember something, and then she turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a strange color flashing in her eyes. Did you already know something? After Lin Yu heard Susan say this, he couldn't help but frown slightly. After struggling for a moment, he nodded gently. Think about it, it's definitely not an accident that the old guy came here, and when the old guy came here, I heard footsteps. What do the footsteps mean? I think you should know it. At this time, Lin Yu raised his head, his eyes staring directly at Susan, and a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Susan also took a breath of cold air. She was completely short-sighted between the corners of her eyes and eyebrows, a look of disbelief. After a long while, Susan subconsciously stepped back a few steps. Bulatin followed up and shook his head slightly. Impossible, this is absolutely impossible, you must be kidding me, right? It was obvious that Susan was somewhat unconscious at this time, perhaps due to fright, or perhaps due to other reasons. At this moment, Lin Yu just shook his head, and then sighed leisurely. Oh, they were one step ahead, so they got there first, but it's not a big deal. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 339. But if the map falls into their hands now, I'm afraid there will be another round of bloody storm, which is not good. After hearing what Susan said, Lin Yu turned around and rolled his eyes at her unhappily. What can we do if it's not good? Take one step at a time, watch one step at a time. If you really want to go to the ruins, just follow them. Lin Yu's tone was neither fast nor slow, and Susan at this time seemed to remember something after hearing what Lin Yu said, and a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, and then she nodded slightly. You are right, just take one step at a time. As for the rest, there is no other way. After Susan finished speaking, she sighed heavily, and a few special colors appeared in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. And just a moment later, a figure rushed towards Susan. The figure was extremely fast, holding a dagger in his hand, and the dagger flashed with cold light. At this time, Susan wanted to dodge, but it was too late, so she was also surprised at this time, with her eyes wide open and her mouth wide open, and a few special colors flashed in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu just turned around and kicked, and then kicked the guy out directly. The guy retreated several steps in a row, and then he barely stabilized his body, and then he spurted out a mouthful of blood. At this time, his eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of unwillingness. At this time, he said with gritted teeth, "You kid is just looking for death." At this time, Lin Yu slowly walked towards the man, staring at the guy with a smile on his face, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "I'm looking for death? Are you sure?" At this time, Lin Yu's face was as gloomy as water. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the man couldn't help swallowing his saliva, and a look of disbelief flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "You, don't come over, I tell you, if you dare to come over, I will kill you." Obviously, this guy has been stunned by the scene just now, because there is a deep cut on his chest that can reach the bone, and the wound is still bleeding, which looks extremely terrifying. But at this time, Lin Yu didn't care about him at the time, and just walked straight towards him, and then others leaned over, lowered their heads and stared at this guy. "You should be a victim too, don't worry, I won't hurt you, but you have to tell me what happened just now." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the man. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the man's face suddenly turned pale. At this time, he waved his hands and shook his head desperately, as if he had encountered the most terrible thing in the world. There was a kind of fear in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "No, I don't want to say it, I don't want to say it, I don't want to say it, I can't say it, I can't say it." At this time, Lin Yu saw this guy, and his face was slightly condensed at that time, and a few special colors flashed in his eyes. "What can't be said? If you don't say it, don't blame me." Can't say, terrible, hell, they came in to kill people, they just killed people, without saying a word, killing everyone they met." At this time, the man had a little cry in the end, and looked particularly pitiful. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a bit of solemnity. At this time, he frowned slightly, and a bit of strange color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "What's going on? Tell me quickly." At this time, Lin Yu stared at the guy. After a moment, the man subconsciously took a few steps back, and then fell to the ground, then covered his head and screamed. Lin Yu's eyebrows seemed to be twisted together, but when he saw the guy like this, he felt a bit of pity in his heart. "What did they do to you? Tell me, you are safe now, they are gone." At this time, the man's consciousness seemed to collapse suddenly, and he picked up a dagger and stabbed it directly into his lower abdomen, and then suddenly raised it upwards, and blood flowed all over the ground. At this time, Susan screamed in fear and fainted. Lin Yu picked Susan up. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness. He admitted that he didn't want to meddle in other people's business, but the things these guys did were so harmful that they completely angered Lin Yu. So at this moment, after thinking for a moment, Lin Yu also raised a sneer at the corner of his mouth. Very good, it seems that it's time to collect this debt. The night is really haunted. The reason why Lin Yu concluded that this was done by Ye was entirely because there was a special symbol on the wall of this place. This special symbol looked extremely complicated, but Lin Yu could see that it was Ye's symbol, no doubt. At this moment, Lin Yu slowly picked up Susan and walked outside. His steps were very light, as if he was afraid of disturbing Susan. His cautious look was quite interesting. In fact, Lin Yu was afraid of disturbing the dead souls here, and at this moment he suddenly found that there seemed to be something strange behind the bar in the distance. Lin Yu's brows seemed to be twisted together, and he slowly walked towards the direction of the bar. But when he came to the bar, he found that there was not even a corpse behind the bar. The original bartender was nowhere to be found, and the bloodstains on the bar seemed to prove that someone had been seriously injured here. When Lin Yu saw this scene, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 340. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes. Some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly, and the corners of his mouth also raised. A bit of a sneer. Interesting. It's really interesting. I just don't know what is behind this door. After Lin Yu thought of this, he slowly walked forward. At this time, as if he had remembered something, he suddenly stopped and then walked towards the front. He glanced at his right rear. At this moment, a burst of footsteps came from outside the door, led by a young man in a suit. The young man clapped his hands gently, and then several people came to block it. Door. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu also had a slight sneer on his lips, and there was a complete sense of contempt in the corners of his eyes and brows. To say that it is true now, cats and dogs dare to come out. It is extremely ridiculous and extremely stupid. When the young man heard what Lin Yu said, the killing intent in his body suddenly appeared. At this time, his eyes and brows were filled with a gloomy look. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's back, and a cold murderous intent was revealed. Boy, turn around. The young man said so coldly. At this time, Lin Yu didn't pay attention to the young man at all, but slowly walked towards the sofa in front of him. He put Susan on the sofa very gently, and then slowly turned around and looked back. At this time, the young man's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu, with a bit of coldness flashing in his eyes, and his body was filled with murderous intent. Boy, you are very cool, don't you take me seriously. After Lin Yu heard what the young man said, he suddenly smiled. At this time, he slowly turned around and glanced at the young man, with a few curls at the corners of his mouth. A sneer. Do I take you seriously? Who do you think you are? Don't think that with a few people and a few dogs, you can be so arrogant and wanton in front of me. Lin Yu's voice became gloomy and hoarse. At this moment, after the young man felt the cold aura on Lin Yu's body, his face became so condensed. Then he waved his hand quickly. Summon the nether dog quickly and kill this kid. The 6 people behind him formed the seals with their hands in unison at the same time. At this moment, they heard the 6 of them uttering 3 words from their mouths almost at the same time, Netherworld dog. Then 6 vicious dogs suddenly appeared in front of them. These 6 vicious dogs had black hair and fangs, and their claws glowed with scarlet light. Moreover, behind the ghost dog, there seemed to be several bone spurs. It was revealed without reservation. Alien Beast, Nether Dog Lord Level 6, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Intermediate. Life, 999999. Speed, 999999. Defense, 999,999. Attack, 999,999. Skills, Bite, Swallow. Bite, the nether dog activates the skill, pounces on a skill, and bites the enemy desperately with its fangs and ghost claws. The toughness is increased 3 times and the physical strength is increased 5 times. Swallow, the nether dog activates skills. Any enemy defeated by the nether dog and whose blood is devoured will have a random skill that the nether dog will directly learn. After Lin Yu saw this scene, a slight sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he shook his head. Such a low-level beast has the nerve to show it out now. Don't you think it's embarrassing? Everybody feels ashamed. In fact, even Lin Yu had to admit that the devouring skills of this ghost dog were indeed incredible. Even after he saw such skills, he couldn't help but feel a bit of envy in the corners of his eyes and brows. Of course, he couldn't express his envy. This devouring skill can be regarded as heaven-defying, but it is a pity that the level of this nether dog is too low. Although this nether dog can be regarded as a strange beast with growth attributes, its current level is too low, and its strength is naturally not very good. So at this time, Lin Yu didn't take this ghost dog seriously at all. He just looked calm and calm. At this moment, the 6 netherworld disciples, after seeing this scene, were quite angry. At this time, their eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, and their murderous intent came out of them like this. It spread like this on their bodies. Boy, I think you are a little too arrogant in this way, but since you want to seek death, it would be quite unjustifiable if I don't help you. After the netherworld's 6 sons finished speaking, they waved their hands suddenly, and then the netherworld dog flew directly towards Lin Yu. Looking at that posture, if they didn't bite Lin Yu into pieces, they would definitely don't give up. At this time, Lin Yu saw the ghost dogs rushing toward him. A sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he shook his head. There are just a few dogs who want to take advantage of me. It's like trying to block the car and overestimating one's ability. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he directly summoned the space-time beast. After all, it was just a lord-level beast. Compared with the space-time beast, the difference in realm was too great. At this moment, in Lin Yu's sea of consciousness, the 3 guys, Earth-Splitting Bear, White Tiger, and He Lu Yu, were sitting around a table, playing cards like this before. 1 to 3. 1 to 2. I'll go, I'm just 1 on 3. After He Lu Yu heard what Bai Hu said, he raised his head and glanced at him expressionlessly. Yes, if you play 1 on 3, what's the problem if I play 1 on 2? At this moment, the white tiger suddenly stood up, and the ground-breaking bear quickly hugged the white tiger. No, that's not the case, brother Bai Hu. This guy hasn't played a few times since he was summoned by the master. I don't think he's been looking like this all day long, so there's no need to argue with him. There's no need to argue with him like that. At this moment, He Lu Yu was sitting on the card table, still expressionless.